Welcome to Private Stories, where people discover who they really are. Jackson Reed woke up at 6 in the morning. The apartment around him felt strangely heavy, as if the silence itself had weight. Outside the window, a distant engine rumbled somewhere in the early streets of Detroit. Light rain tapped softly on the roof. Beside him, Emily was still asleep, curled under the thick gray blanket. Her breathing was calm and even. But Jackson felt something wrong. Something invisible had changed between them during the past months. Emily had begun staying late at work more and more often. Urgent projects, she said. Important meetings, she said. Her phone, which once lay casually on the kitchen table, was now always in her hand. If it rang at odd hours, she would quietly walk into another room and close the door behind her. Not long ago, they used to talk about everything. Even meaningless things. The neighbor noisy dog. Morning traffic on the news. Funny videos online. Now her replies were short and distant. That morning Jackson tried to convince himself that he was imagining things. He went to the kitchen and brewed strong black tea. The smell of toasted bread filled the small apartment. Emily rarely ate breakfast, but he still left a sandwich on the table. Just in case. Before leaving for work, he glanced once more toward the bedroom. Emily had not moved. Her face looked unfamiliar, almost like the face of a stranger who had borrowed the body of his wife. The factory in Detroit greeted him with the usual metallic rhythm. Jackson worked as a machinist. All day the steel lathe spun with hypnotic precision. The steady motion usually helped him clear his thoughts. But today the thoughts refused to leave. His coworker and longtime friend Mike noticed the silence. Mike handed him a paper cup of coffee and grinned. "Hey man, you look like someone stole your truck." Jackson forced a small smile. "Just tired. Nothing more." But even Mike seemed unconvinced. That evening Jackson stopped by a grocery store on his way home. He walked through the aisles almost automatically. Milk, bread, coffee. Nothing unusual. At the checkout his eyes accidentally caught a small golden card displayed near the counter. It looked like a glossy business card. On it was printed a name he had never heard before. Moonlight Lounge. Jackson frowned. Something about the card scratched his memory. Then suddenly he remembered. A few days earlier he had noticed a similar card on Emily's desk at home. She quickly slipped it into her bag when she realized he had looked in that direction. At the time he had not asked questions. But now the memory refused to disappear. He paid for the groceries and walked outside into the damp evening air. The city lights reflected on the wet asphalt. Traffic hissed along the streets. When he entered the apartment, Emily was sitting on the couch. Her face lit softly by the glow of her phone screen. She was smiling slightly. Jackson placed the grocery bags on the kitchen counter. "How was your day?" Emily did not look up immediately. "Normal. Busy." Her thumbs continued typing messages. "You stayed late again." "Just work." Her voice sounded calm. But something in her eyes flickered for a second. A brief flash of tension. Jackson felt as if he were standing at the edge of a deep canyon. A place where one wrong step could destroy everything. During dinner they spoke very little. The sound of forks touching plates seemed louder than usual. Later that night curiosity finally won. Jackson knew it was wrong. But the feeling inside his chest grew stronger than his sense of decency. While Emily was in the bathroom, he quietly opened her handbag. Lipstick, keys, perfume, phone charger. Then, in a small side pocket, he found it. The same golden card. Moonlight Lounge. Jackson sat slowly at the kitchen table. The card felt strangely heavy in his hand. When Emily returned, she wore a soft robe. Her dark hair fell freely over her shoulders. She kissed him lightly on the cheek. "Good night." Her smile looked practiced. Jackson nodded silently. She disappeared into the bedroom. He remained alone in the dim kitchen. The tea in his mug had already gone cold. Somewhere deep inside him something cracked. Quietly, almost invisibly. But he knew their life would never sound the same again. The next morning Jackson woke before the alarm. Sleep had come only in fragments. Short, restless pieces filled with blurred thoughts and unfinished dreams. The image of the golden card kept returning to his mind again and again. Moonlight Lounge. The name echoed in his head like a distant whisper. Emily was still asleep. Her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. For a moment Jackson simply watched her. 10 years of marriage lay between them. 10 years of shared mornings and quiet evenings. Vacations, arguments, laughter. And now something else had appeared between them. Something colder. He stood up quietly and went to the kitchen. The coffee machine hummed softly. Steam rose from the cup as he leaned against the counter. "What are you doing, Jackson?" The question circled in his mind. Part of him wanted to confront her immediately, demand the truth. Another part understood that truth rarely appeared when someone was cornered. Truth had to be caught, like a shadow. The day at the factory passed slowly. Metal sparks flashed beneath the machines. The sharp smell of oil filled the workshop. Mike tried once again to lighten the mood. "Man, you look like you lost $1 million. Jackson shrugged. "Maybe I did." Mike laughed, not realizing how close he might be to the truth. By evening Jackson had made a decision. He would follow her. Just once. Just to end the uncertainty. That night Emily said the words he already expected. "I have to stay late at work. Big project deadline. Maybe until midnight." Jackson simply nodded. No suspicion in his voice. No anger in his expression. "Okay." She grabbed her coat. Her perfume lingered in the hallway after the door closed. Jackson waited exactly 3 minutes. Then he stood up, put on his jacket, and stepped outside. The stairwell echoed softly with his footsteps. On the street he saw Emily walking quickly toward the bus stop. But she did not take the bus. Instead a taxi pulled up beside her. She entered quickly. Jackson raised his hand and stopped another cab. "Follow that car. But keep distance." The driver glanced at him in the mirror and nodded with quiet understanding. Detroit moved past them in streaks of neon light and wet pavement. Jackson's heart pounded slowly but heavily. Strangely he felt calm. Almost relieved. Soon everything would become clear. The taxi ahead stopped in front of a bright building covered in glowing purple lights. Moonlight Lounge. Emily stepped out. She adjusted her coat, touched her hair, then walked toward the entrance. Jackson remained in the car for several seconds, watching, thinking. 10 minutes passed. Then he finally stepped out and approached the door. Music poured from inside. Deep bass vibrations mixed with laughter and glasses clinking. The bar was crowded. Soft violet lights drifted through the smoky air. In one corner, a saxophone player performed a slow jazz melody. Jackson scanned the room. Then he saw her. Emily sat at a small round table. Across from her was a tall man in an expensive suit. His posture radiated confidence. A silver watch gleamed on his wrist. They were laughing. Emily leaned closer. Her hand lightly touched the man's arm. Jackson felt his chest tighten. But he forced himself not to react. He stepped behind a thick column near the bar. From there he could see them clearly. The man said something that made Emily throw her head back in laughter. Then suddenly he leaned forward and kissed her. Not a quick, friendly gesture.
Orealkish.
Slow, intimate,
Familiar.
In that moment, the last fragile hope inside Jackson disappeared. This was not misunderstanding, not coincidence, not a harmless meeting. It was betrayal, clear and undeniable. Jackson turned immediately and walked toward the exit. Cold air struck his face outside. Snow had begun falling lightly. He stood there for a long time staring into the empty street. Memories rushed through his mind. Their wedding day. Their first apartment. Long drives across Michigan in the summer. All those moments now felt like fragile glass shattering under invisible pressure. When Emily returned home later that night, Jackson asked nothing. Not a single question. She entered the apartment cheerfully. Tired smile on her lips. "Long day," she said. Jackson simply nodded. Inside his mind, however, something had already begun forming. A quiet thought, cold and sharp like winter wind. He would not scream. He would not beg. He would not collapse. Instead, he would make them feel the weight of what they had done. The next morning, Jackson woke before sunrise. The city outside Detroit was still wrapped in gray winter darkness. Snow covered the streets like a silent blanket. For a long time, he lay staring at the ceiling. The image of Emily in that bar refused to leave his mind. Her laughter, her hand touching another man. That kiss. Strangely, the pain inside him had already begun turning into something colder, something controlled. He slowly got out of bed and went to the kitchen. Coffee filled the apartment with a bitter smell. Jackson opened a small notebook that usually held work measurements and factory notes. On the first empty page, he wrote a single question. What do I want? He stared at the words for a long time. At first, there was only anger. But then something else appeared. Not just truth. Not just confrontation. He wanted them to understand. To feel what betrayal really meant. A quiet plan began forming in his mind. Precise. Methodical. Just like the work he did every day with steel and machines. Emily left the apartment around 8. She barely looked at him while putting on her coat. Probably another late evening today, she said casually. Jackson only nodded. When the door closed, the apartment felt unusually empty. He sat down at the table and opened his laptop. If he wanted to understand what was happening, he needed to start with the man from the bar. The search was easier than he expected. Moonlight Lounge had social media pages filled with photographs from corporate events and expensive parties. Jackson scrolled through dozens of images. Then suddenly he saw him. The same tall man. The confident posture. The expensive watch. Standing next to a group of businessmen during a charity gala. The caption below the photo revealed the name. Nathaniel Carter, Chief Financial Officer of a large investment company in Chicago. Jackson leaned closer to the screen. Nathaniel Carter looked exactly like the kind of man who believed the world belonged to him. Perfect suit, perfect smile, perfect confidence. Jackson continued searching. Articles appeared. Interviews. Photos of luxury cars. Trips to Europe. Nathaniel Carter seemed to live the life of someone who had never faced real consequences. But one small detail caught Jackson's attention. In an old article, there was mention of a questionable financial deal involving Carter Company. Nothing proven, but enough to raise suspicion. Jackson saved the article. Then he saved several photographs. Hours passed while he gathered information piece by piece. By afternoon, he already knew Carter's home address in Chicago, his work schedule, even the exclusive nightclub he frequently visited on weekends. Jackson closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. The plan in his mind began to grow clearer. If someone like Carter lost something important, reputation, career, money, his entire world could collapse very quickly. And Emily would see exactly who she had chosen over her husband. That evening, Emily returned home later than usual. She walked into the apartment with the same careless smile. Long day, she said while placing her bag on the chair. Jackson watched her quietly. Every movement, every expression. Now he saw details he had ignored before. The perfume she wore when she met Carter. The way she avoided looking directly into his eyes. Dinner passed in silence. Emily seemed distracted. Her phone vibrated several times. Each time she quickly checked the screen and typed a reply. Jackson already knew who was on the other side of those messages. Later that night, when Emily fell asleep, he quietly opened her bag again. This time he placed a tiny voice recorder inside the lining. Small enough to remain unnoticed. Cold enough to collect every word she spoke. Jackson returned to the kitchen and looked again at his notebook. 3 lines now filled the page. Find the truth. Destroy the illusion. Move forward. Outside the window, snow continued falling slowly over Detroit. Inside, Jackson felt the strange calm of a man who had already crossed a line he could never return from. But something unexpected was about to appear in his life. Something that would challenge everything he was planning. And her name was Irene Harper. Winter tightened its grip on Detroit. Snow covered the sidewalks in thick, uneven layers. The cold wind moved through the narrow streets like a quiet warning. Jackson walked home from the factory with slow, heavy steps. The machines had been louder than usual that day. Or maybe the noise only felt louder because his mind refused to rest. His revenge plan was slowly becoming real. The recordings from Emily's phone conversations had already confirmed everything. She spoke with Nathaniel Carter almost every day, sometimes laughing, sometimes whispering about trips they planned together. Once she even said something that made Jackson's chest tighten. "Soon I will tell him I am leaving." Jackson had listened to that sentence 3 times. Each time the anger inside him burned hotter, but he forced himself to stay calm. Everything had to be precise, like cutting steel on a machine lathe. No mistakes, no emotions, just results. That evening he stopped at a grocery store near his apartment. The warm yellow light inside felt strangely comforting after the freezing wind outside. He walked through the aisles without much thought. Bread, eggs, coffee, just ordinary things. Things that belonged to a normal life. A life that no longer existed. Suddenly a loud clatter broke the quiet atmosphere. Jackson turned his head. A woman had dropped her shopping bag near the vegetable section. Oranges rolled across the floor. Potatoes scattered in different directions. The woman looked embarrassed while the tired cashier sighed impatiently. Without thinking, Jackson stepped forward and knelt down. "Let me help." The woman looked at him with surprise. Her eyes were green and warm despite the tiredness in her face. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice carried a strange mixture of strength and exhaustion. They quickly gathered the fallen vegetables. When she stood up, Jackson noticed her hair. Soft copper-red waves falling to her shoulders. Some loose strands framed her face. "Sorry about the mess," she said, adjusting the bag on her shoulder. "Long day." Jackson gave a small nod. "Those happen." For a moment they stood there awkwardly. Then he realized the bag still looked heavy. "I can carry that if you want." The woman hesitated, then smiled faintly. That would actually help. Outside, the evening air was cold but calm. Streetlights reflected on the snow, creating golden halos on the pavement. They walked slowly along the quiet sidewalk. "My name is Jackson," he said. "Irene." Her smile became a little warmer this time. During the short walk, she told him that she had recently moved into the neighborhood. Her life had changed not long ago. Her husband had been controlling and cruel for years. One day she packed her things and left. Now she was trying to start from the beginning. New apartment, new job, new future. "Sometimes you have to leave everything behind just to save yourself," she said quietly. Jackson felt those words touch something deep inside him. He thought about Emily, about betrayal, about the revenge plan waiting inside his notebook. Maybe leaving was sometimes the only way forward. Everything carefully arranged. But suddenly another thought appeared in his mind. A different path. Not revenge. Not destruction. Just life. For the first time in months, Jackson added a new line at the bottom of the page. "Meet Irene again." Outside, snow continued falling slowly over Detroit. And somewhere in the quiet city, 2 completely different futures were beginning to form. One built from anger. The other from something far warmer. Jackson still did not know which one he would choose. But for the first time in a long time, the choice existed. The days that followed passed like slow-moving winter clouds over Detroit. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. The factory machines still roared every morning. Metal still screamed against steel. Workers still joked during lunch breaks. But inside Jackson, something had begun to change. The revenge plan remained written inside his notebook. Every detail precise. Every step ready. Yet now another thought occasionally interrupted those cold calculations. Pair of green eyes. Quiet voice. Irene. 3 days after their first meeting, Jackson saw her again. It happened almost by accident. He was leaving the grocery store after work when he noticed her standing near the entrance. Snowflakes rested on her copper hair. She wore a long gray coat and held a paper cup of coffee. For a moment she looked surprised. Then she smiled. Jackson. He felt something unexpected inside his chest. A calm warmth.
Irene.
They stood there for a moment while people moved around them. Cold wind pushed light snow across the parking lot. I was just about to grab coffee, she said, lifting the cup slightly. Want to join? Jackson hesitated for a second. Normally he would have gone straight home. But tonight something inside him refused to return to the quiet apartment where Emily messages waited like silent lies. Sure, he said. They walked to a small cafe 2 blocks away. The place was simple and warm. Yellow lamps, soft music. The smell of fresh pastries filled the air. They chose a table near the window. Outside snow continued falling slowly over the streetlights. At first their conversation was cautious. Simple questions. Work, weather, the neighborhood. But gradually the silence between them became comfortable. Irene spoke about her dream of opening a small clothing repair studio. Nothing fancy, she said with a small laugh. Just a place where people can fix things instead of throwing them away. Jackson listened carefully. He noticed how her eyes lit up when she spoke about her plans. For a moment he forgot about everything else. Forgot about Emily. Forgot about Carter. Forgot about revenge. What about you? Irene asked after a while. Jackson leaned back in his chair. The question felt heavier than it should. What about me? What do you want from life? The words caught him off guard. No one had asked him that in a long time. He thought for several seconds before answering. Peace, maybe. Just peace. Irene studied his face quietly. You look like someone who has been fighting a war. Jackson gave a small tired smile. Maybe I have. She did not ask more questions. Instead, she simply nodded. Sometimes wars end not because someone wins, she said. Sometimes they end because someone decides to stop fighting. Those words stayed in Jackson's mind long after the conversation changed. Later that night, when he returned home, Emily was already there. She sat on the couch scrolling through her phone. Her dark hair fell loosely over her shoulders. You are late, she said casually. Just coffee with a coworker, Jackson replied calmly. Emily barely reacted. Good. I have another late meeting tomorrow anyway. Jackson nodded and walked to the kitchen. For the first time, her indifference no longer felt like a knife in his chest. Something inside him had shifted. That night, he opened the notebook again. The revenge plans stared at him from the pages. Nathaniel Carter. Evidence. Anonymous letters. Carefully planned exposure. Everything ready. Jackson closed the notebook slowly. Then he opened a new blank page. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. Finally, he wrote 2 words. New life. He did not know exactly what that meant yet. But for the first time, the future seemed larger than the past. Outside, the snow continued falling silently over Detroit. And somewhere not far away, Irene Harper was probably also looking at the same winter sky, without knowing that her presence had already begun changing the course of someone's life forever. Yet the storm that Jackson had already set in motion was still coming. The city slowly drifted toward the end of the year. Christmas lights appeared in store windows. Snow covered Detroit in soft white layers. People hurried through the streets carrying colorful bags and warm drinks. But Jackson Reed felt strangely detached from the holiday atmosphere. He watched the crowds from the bus window on his way to the factory. Inside his mind, 2 completely different worlds were colliding. One belonged to revenge, the other to something new and uncertain. Irene. During the past weeks, they had met several times. Coffee after work. Short walks through the snowy park. Simple conversations that felt surprisingly easy. With her, Jackson felt calm. With her, silence did not feel heavy. But the other part of his life still existed. Emily. And the man named Nathaniel Carter. Jackson had not abandoned his plan. In fact, the plan had already begun moving forward. 3 days earlier, he had sent an anonymous package to the administration of an exclusive nightclub in downtown Chicago. Inside the envelope were copies of documents, financial reports, old articles, several suspicious transactions connected to Carter Company. Jackson had carefully written a short note. If you check your financial guest, Mr. Carter, more carefully, you might discover something interesting. It was not a direct accusation, just a spark. But sparks could start very large fires. Jackson knew that Carter often celebrated New Year Eve in that club. Powerful businessmen, private investors, important connections. If suspicion appeared in the wrong moment, his reputation could collapse in a single night. And reputation was everything for a man like Carter. On the evening of December 31st, Emily prepared to go out. She wore a dark red dress Jackson had never seen before. Her hair fell in elegant waves over her shoulders. He immediately understood who she was dressing for. "How are you spending New Year?" she asked casually while adjusting an earring in the mirror. "Home," Jackson replied calmly. She nodded without offering him an invitation. That had become normal now. The door closed behind her. Her perfume lingered briefly in the hallway. Jackson walked slowly to the kitchen window. Outside, fireworks had already begun in the distance. The city was alive with celebration. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey and waited. Midnight approached. People outside shouted and laughed. Cars honked. Fireworks exploded above the rooftops. Then his phone vibrated. A message from Mike. But the message was not about holiday greetings. "You won't believe this. That rich finance guy from Chicago, Nathaniel Carter. Police showed up at the club tonight. Some financial investigation. Looks like he's in serious trouble." Jackson stared at the message. A slow, quiet smile appeared on his face. The first move had worked. Carter world had just cracked. And Emily was probably standing somewhere nearby watching it happen. Confused. Frightened. Realizing that the man she had chosen might not be as powerful as she believed. Jackson placed the phone back on the table. Outside, fireworks filled the sky with bright flashes of color. For everyone else, the new year had begun with celebration. For Jackson, it had begun with justice. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual. The apartment felt silent and strangely peaceful. Emily had not returned during the night. Jackson dressed and walked outside. Fresh snow glittered in the morning sunlight. He found himself walking toward the small cafe where he had met Irene before. And as if the universe had decided to answer something inside him, she was already there, sitting near the window, holding a warm cup of coffee. When she saw him, her face brightened with a gentle smile. "Happy New Year, Jackson." "Happy New Year, Irene." He sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. But the silence felt comfortable, safe. Jackson suddenly realized something important. For months, his world had been filled with anger and betrayal. But sitting here with Irene, watching snow fall quietly outside, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Yet the story between him and Emily was far from over, and the consequences of everything he had started were only beginning to unfold. Morning light slowly filled the quiet streets of Detroit. The snow that had fallen during the night glittered under pale winter sunlight. Jackson walked home from the cafe feeling calmer than he had in months. The conversation with Irene still echoed in his mind. It had been simple. No dramatic confessions. No complicated questions. Just warmth. And a quiet understanding. For the first time in a long while, Jackson felt that his life might actually move forward. But the moment he opened the apartment door, reality returned. Emily was home. She stood in the kitchen near the sink, still wearing the same dress from the night before. Her makeup was slightly smudged and her eyes looked tired. When she saw him, she straightened immediately. "Morning," she said quickly. Jackson hung his coat and looked at her calmly. "How was the party?" Emily hesitated. The confidence that usually colored her voice was gone. "Fine. Just a little chaotic." Jackson leaned against the doorway. Really? She looked away. Her fingers nervously twisted the edge of the kitchen towel. Something happened last night, she finally admitted. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Did it? Emily exhaled slowly. Nathaniel got into some kind of trouble. Police came to the club. People started leaving. It was embarrassing. Her voice carried frustration but also fear. Jackson watched her silently. What kind of trouble? She shook her head. Financial investigation or something. I don't know the details. He hasn't answered my messages since. For a moment neither of them spoke. Jackson felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. The plan had worked exactly as intended. But instead of triumph, he mostly felt tired. Emily suddenly looked directly into his eyes. Jackson, I think everything is falling apart. Her voice sounded fragile. And the man you chose, she continued quietly. The one who seemed so perfect. Emily swallowed hard. I thought he was different. Jackson let out a quiet breath. People like him are always the same. They shine when things go well, and disappear when problems begin. Emily sat down heavily at the kitchen table. Her shoulders drooped. I don't know what to do now. For the first time Jackson saw genuine uncertainty in her face. The confident woman who once laughed in Moonlight Lounge seemed to have vanished. That evening the apartment felt unusually tense. Emily stayed mostly silent. She kept checking her phone. Each time the screen remained empty, her expression darkened further. Meanwhile, Jackson's thoughts drifted elsewhere. Toward Irene. Toward the warmth he felt whenever they spoke. Later that night, as he sat in the living room, Emily finally approached him. Jackson. He looked up. She hesitated before continuing. I think we need to talk. He nodded slowly. Maybe we do. Emily sat across from him. For several seconds she struggled to find the words. Then finally they came out in a rush. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. Jackson remained silent. I thought I deserved something more exciting. Something bigger than our ordinary life. Her voice trembled. But now everything feels empty. He studied her carefully. The woman sitting before him looked different from the one he had followed into Moonlight Lounge. Less confident. Less certain. More human. And what do you want now? He asked quietly. Emily looked down at her hands. I don't know. Maybe a second chance. Those words hung in the air like fragile glass. Jackson did not answer immediately. Inside his mind, two images stood side by side. Emily from the past. And Irene with her warm green eyes and calm voice. Finally Jackson spoke. A second chance doesn't erase what happened. Emily nodded slowly. I know. The silence that followed felt heavy but honest. For the first time in months they were no longer pretending. But Jackson also understood something else. Even if forgiveness was possible, it did not mean the past could return. That night he lay awake staring into the darkness. Somewhere in the city Irene was sleeping peacefully. Somewhere Nathaniel Carter was probably fighting to save his collapsing career. And here in the apartment the final chapter of his marriage was slowly approaching. Jackson knew that soon he would have to make a decision. Not about revenge. That chapter was already closing. But about the future, and which road he truly wanted to follow. Because sometimes the hardest choice was not between anger and forgiveness. Sometimes it was between the past and the life waiting ahead. The following week passed slowly. Winter still ruled Detroit. Gray clouds hung low over the city. Dirty snow gathered along the sidewalks where cars had pushed it aside. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere between Jackson and Emily had changed. They were no longer pretending that everything was normal. The truth now existed between them like a quiet but permanent wall. Emily spent more time at home than before. She rarely went out. Her phone no longer buzzed with late-night messages. Nathaniel Carter had completely disappeared from her life. One evening Jackson returned from the factory and found Emily sitting on the couch with a glass of wine. That alone felt unusual. She rarely drank alone. Her eyes looked red as if she had been crying. You okay? He asked while removing his jacket. Emily flinched slightly hearing his voice. Yes. Just thinking. Jackson walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. Thinking about Carter, he asked calmly. Emily lowered her eyes. Yes. There was a short silence. He stopped answering me after the investigation started, she admitted quietly. I tried calling, texting. Nothing. Jackson leaned against the kitchen counter. He knew exactly why Carter had disappeared. Men like that never stayed when things became complicated. And what do you feel about that? Jackson asked. Emily let out a bitter laugh. Stupid. I feel stupid. She stared into the wine glass as if the answer might be hiding there. I thought he was my chance for a better life. Turns out I was just entertainment. Jackson watched her for a moment. There was no satisfaction in hearing that. Only a quiet tiredness. Emily looked up again. Jackson, I really did ruin everything, didn't I? He took a slow breath before answering. You made your choices. And choices always have consequences. Emily nodded slowly. Tears formed in her eyes again. I wish I could undo it. Jackson did not respond. Because deep inside he knew something important. Even if the past could be forgiven, could never truly be undone. During the next few days, Emily tried several times to start normal conversations. She asked about his work, about his day, about small everyday things. Jackson answered politely but briefly. The warmth that once existed between them had faded. Meanwhile, Jackson continued meeting Irene. They met in the small cafe, walked through the snowy park, sometimes simply sat and talked for hours. With Irene, everything felt natural. She told him about the small clothing repair studio she was preparing to open. It was a modest dream, but she spoke about it with passion. One evening they stood outside the building she had rented. The sign above the door was still empty. Soon it will be ready, she said with a shy smile. Jackson looked around the small workshop inside. Wooden shelves, old sewing machines, fabric samples. Felt alive with possibility. You built this yourself, he said. Irene shrugged softly. Piece by piece. Sometimes starting over is the only way forward. Jackson looked at her. Her words carried the quiet strength of someone who had already survived loss. At that moment he realized something clearly. Revenge had once seemed like the only path. But revenge did not build anything. It only destroyed. Irene, however, represented something different. A future. Later that night Jackson returned home. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table. She looked nervous. Jackson, we need to talk again, she said quietly. He sat across from her. Emily took a deep breath. I have been thinking a lot. About us. About everything. Her voice trembled slightly. I don't think things can go back to the way they were. Jackson nodded slowly. Neither do I. Tears filled her eyes, but she did not look away. Maybe it is better if we separate. The words hung in the room like a final decision. Jackson felt a strange calm settle inside him. Maybe it is, he replied quietly. Emily wiped her eyes. I never wanted to hurt you like this. Jackson stood up slowly. But it happened. And now we both have to live with it. That night they slept in different rooms. The apartment felt quieter than ever, but the silence no longer felt suffocating. Instead it felt like the end of a long storm, and the beginning of something unknown. In the days that followed, Emily packed her belongings. Suitcases appeared in the hallway. Clothes disappeared from the closet. One cold morning she finally stood near the door with the last bag in her hand. Jackson walked her to the entrance. For a moment they looked at each other. 10 years of memories stood between them. Take care of yourself, Emily said softly. You too. She nodded, then walked down the stairs and disappeared into the gray winter street. Jackson closed the door. For several minutes he stood alone in the silent apartment. Strangely, he did not feel sadness, only relief. Later that evening he called Irene. Are you busy? He asked. No, she replied warmly. Jackson looked through the window at the snowy Detroit skyline. I was thinking maybe we could have dinner tonight. I would like that, she said. And for the first time in a very long time, Jackson truly smiled. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Visit our channel for interesting and intriguing stories.